the summer edition will be coming out, and my story hopefully will be either in the fall or the winter edition. So this is the new script for the fire, but that's where the story of the Cleveland Hill fire will be. There's a lot more to the fire, however, than just the fire and the fact that all these children lost their lives senselessly. You know, that fire could have been prevented. It could have been prevented 100 times. Now, a lot of people say, well, why was there an annex? Why was there an annex outside the Cleveland Hill main building? Well, there were annexes attached to schools all over Western New York, Wyoming County, Cheektowaga County, Cheektowaga County, including the city of Buffalo. They were just wooden buildings meant to only be used for a short time. The Cleveland Hill Annex was built in 1941 and was used extensively up until the early 1950s. In 1954, when the fire broke out in the Cleveland Hill Annex, only occasional music classes were held inside the annex, and some first graders would have a brief meeting there early in the morning. Now, throughout the late 1953 year, especially, here's what happened. Employees would come to work and they would go into the annex, and something just wasn't right. Aside from the fact that occasionally children kept saying, you know, why is it so hot in the room? And if it wasn't too hot, it was too cold. Or does something smell? Maybe we should open the windows, but the windows in the annex couldn't be opened. So you wonder why these kids were in that class to begin with. On the morning of the fire, March 31st, 1954, a teacher came into the building from the main school, the brick and mortar school, and she noticed a haze. There was actually a haze that wasn't difficult to see through, but it was there. And it also smelled. Something wasn't right. Now, she just continued to go into the building, and she went into a room across the hallway from where 31 children and 3 adults were using the music class. It was a music class of teacher Melba Siebel. Now, why was this woman in the room across? Well, that room across from the music room had been used ever since the closing of the annex as a break room for teachers and other employees of the Cleveland Hill School District. So she was in the room, and after noticing that haze and that funny smell, she never bothered to report it to the school administration. Does anybody have any idea why she didn't do it? Well, she didn't do it because it had happened so many times before, and the complaints and the concerns of the teachers were never addressed. They were never addressed by the school administration. They never did a thing about it. Now, these sinister forces that I like to refer to, you know, the smoke, the smell of coal, all those invisible forces were just floating around in the nooks and crannies of the annex until that morning at 11:22 a.m. There was a sudden sucking sound, like a swoosh. It wasn't a powerful explosion, but that's what started the Cleveland Hill school fire on that particular morning. Now, I have my own theory as to what started the fire, and I'll explain that to you, and I'll explain why I think that. Because the issue had been brought up by many parents before this. Why did that woman, who was a teacher in the school, why did she come into the break room? She must have had a reason. Was it just to, sit down and unwind a little bit? Or did she maybe come to the break room to have a cigarette? Now, the Buffalo News, a couple of days after the fire, was the first to report the fact that another teacher had notified the school administration that she found cigarette butts in the boys' lavatory inside the annex, in the teacher's room. Now, was she implying that these children were coming in, having a cigarette? Or is it possible that different teachers on a daily basis used the teacher's room as a place to sneak a cigarette? There were never any answers from the school administration. There are so many elements of this tragic story that have cover up written all over it. Known in the industry as CYA, and you know what that means. Well, on the morning of the fire, this teacher was about to leave the room when this swoosh, the sucking sound, and this boom, just rocked the building. It was so powerful that it was even felt inside the main school building. And she says, "Oh my God, I better go across and warn Melba Siebold and all these children in the music class that something's happening here. There's a fire." She was leaving the room and about to cross the hall, but she had to stop because there was a wall of fire and she couldn't get across. And so she ran out of the building, back into the teacher's room, and jumped out through a window and landed out on the grass on the east side of the building. At that point, the fire just roared into the music class, where two adults, the main teacher and a student teacher who was there on her last day, were working. And there just happened to be a cap and gown salesman who just was there. He had delivered some products to the school, and he just happened to be in the room, just hanging out. Now, when the fire roared in through that door, which was open, the first thing these kids did was start screaming, and they were terrified. There was only one place they could possibly run, and that's toward the windows. Now, all of a sudden, you have 31 children in the room and 3 adults, and they all run towards the windows. Melba Siebold, the music teacher, and her charge, the student teacher, whose name was June Mahaney, they used their fists, they used chairs, they used musical instruments, anything they could possibly get their hands on to break those windows so they could start pushing these children through the windows. some of these children who were pushed through the windows, yes, their lives were saved, but their flesh was just torn apart by shards of glass that were still sticking out. It was horrible. These children were screaming. And as some of them arrived at the windows, the broken windows, the screams began to turn to gasping for air and choking. And within a minute, 10 of those children died. Their bodies were found below the windows, some of them clinging to each other as if to be holding on to each other. It was horrible. All burned beyond recognition. 10 children. One child was badly burned, so badly burned, she had no feet when her body was recovered. Now, we have 10 children dead. It's bad enough. It's bad enough to learn a child, went to school one day and you'll never see that child again. But the parents of these 10 children were now faced with something really agonizing. They were required to go to the Erie County Medical Examiner's office, the county morgue, and positively identified their children. All these charred victims laying on tables, each of them had a tag, and there was a number on the tag. To the best of their ability, all these parents identified their children by a piece of jewelry that they might have had on their finger, or a bracelet on their wrist, or possibly clothing that they were wearing that didn't burn completely, or shoes, anything. And as each child was identified, those numbered tags were replaced with a name. This whole thing took almost 10 hours. 10 hours. Now, once this was complete, you're faced with another dilemma. The children who are in the hospital, some of them fighting for their lives. Within several days, 5 more children died, raising the death toll to 15, and consequently the worst school fire in New York State history. Now, how did the fire start? Well, you know what I think. And when I say it could have been, a carelessly discarded cigarette, or a cigarette being smoked in an area where it shouldn't have been smoked. But still, that would not be the principal and primary cause of the Cleveland Hill fire. The fact that so many teachers over the course of months and months and even a couple of years kept telling the school administration something is wrong in the annex. When you have all these kids complaining it's too hot, there's haze, you can't see across the room, it's hard to breathe. All of these things were just ignored by the school administration. Now, a couple of days after the fire, I don't know if any of you have ever served on a grand jury, but every month, a grand jury is impaneled to investigate all sorts of criminal activity and fires, other occurrences in Erie County. The principal cause, the Erie County grand jury in this case although there are many things to investigate, principally would look into the cause of the Cleveland Hill fire. Now, there were two men who were in charge of maintenance in the building, the chief engineer and an assistant. There were two of them. They told the grand jury, they were among the first to testify before the grand jury, and they said, you know something? This furnace was operating fine the morning of the fire. Nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with the furnace. Well, the grand jury uncovered this, and I'll read this. Within days, the Erie County grand jury was impaneled to investigate the fire. Testimony from state-appointed engineers and investigators from the Erie County District Attorney's Office uncovered a startling list of furnace deficiencies, including, you want to count these on your finger? Including a manually operated damper control arm that was visibly broken. Wasn't even attached to the furnace. An important furnace implement. A circulating air fan in the heat delivery system that was not working for a considerable period of time before the fire. And the plates of a side wall in the furnace firebox and chimney stack had deteriorated to the point where there were holes in the furnace. In addition, thermostats, simple thermostats that would control heat in all of the annex's room were not operating. Were not operating. Now, these two guys say the furnace was operating fine the morning of the fire. Now, after the grand jury, and here's a situation where just about everything that could go wrong went wrong. And the grand jury, at the end of their investigation, issued what's called a no bill. That means no one will be indicted and no one will be held responsible for this horrendous fire. Well, why not? When you have evidence like this, somebody should be held responsible, you would think. Well, here's why these two guys got off scot-free. Even though the district attorney at the time instructed the grand jury, if they found credible evidence against these two men, they were able to indict these two men on a charge of second-degree murder, or second-degree manslaughter, excuse me. But they didn't. You know why? Because the school district's attorneys intervened and said, did you have a written contract with these two men? Were their duties completely spelled out? Now, when they testified before the grand jury, both men said among their responsibilities was maintaining the school's heating plant. They said they were responsible. But despite that, they still weren't indicted. And the attorneys basically told the school board, if these guys are indicted, you're opening up yourself to a lawsuit from these guys because you never spelled out and had them sign a contract indicating exactly what they were responsible for when they came to work on a daily basis. In other words, the attorney was worried that these two guys were going to sue the Cleveland Hill School District. Well, The Cheektowaga Times, after the grand jury returned their baseless report, just excoriated the grand jury for coming up, with a report like that. Again, just a major cover-up where no one is going to be held responsible. When all along, people have been reporting the haze, the odors, even sometimes fire, but nothing was ever done about it. Now, a short time after the grand jury report came out, and they basically said, our conclusion is no bill. No one is going to be held responsible for the school fire. So what does that really mean? Well, you have a situation now where people are beginning to wonder who they should believe. I mean, who should they believe? The school board, the school administration. The school board was doing very, very little at the time. And these guys who were let off scot-free then began talking with the local media. And the chief engineer gave a lengthy interview to the Buffalo Evening News at the time. And he said, I loved all those children. I think about them every day. But that furnace was working fine the morning of the fire. He's making all these comments despite the fact that all of these deficiencies in the furnace have been reported by the grand jury. The grand jury returns no indictments, but yet a scientific board of firefighting engineers, men who devote their lives to investigating fires, their proficiency is such a level, they could. They said they came to a conclusion at the same time the grand jury reported no bill. They called the annex a fire trap. And they virtually said it was built to burn. Another thing too, back when these annexes were built, and I started to tell you about that, they were built for one primary reason. World War II was over, GIs were coming back home. It was the baby boomer generation, They were moving out of Buffalo, moving into the suburbs, and they were having children left and right. And when it came time to go to school, most of the schools in the area were of moderate size, and they could not accommodate all these children. They needed to use these wooden annexes. Now, the annexes were quickly built, 1, 2, 3. In my book, I had asked a question. Because it was the federal government that paid for all of these annexes to be built, did they follow, were they required to follow standard building codes? Or could the federal government do anything they wanted to do? Well, we posed that question to a man from the government. And his answer was, I don't know. It's a good question. So there's also a chance that these annexes were not built to local code because they were so quickly assembled. But anyway, after this fire, our annex was gone. This right here. This building that you see burning here, this building was 100 feet long and 40 feet wide. A few blocks away, there was another annex in a subdivision called Tyrunda. Tyrunda was a low-income area. And the school was occupied by mainly children of people who came to work in the defense industry here in Buffalo, places like Curtiss Wright, Westinghouse, all those big plants that were so prolific back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. This is the music room right here, where the children died. In less than an hour, this entire building, this is all that's left of it. It looked like a forest fire with burned out trees just reaching for the sky. Now, let me pass this photograph. This is a class photograph. And I want you all to take a look at it. So you quickly just look at it, but you'll see numbers by each of the children. Just for the heck of it, be sure to look at number 21. It's a picture of a young lady, number 21. Now, the teacher who's up here on the left, his name was Tom Griffin. He was a wonderful guy. I mean, his class was decimated by the fire. There was 30 kids in that photograph. 50 of them died, and 14 out of 16 of those kids were injured. You take 31, and there were just 2, their whereabouts are unknown. But then number 21 is the one that I'm going to bring up next once you pass that photograph around. Tom Griffin, again, his classroom was just decimated by the fire. He had called in ill the day of the fire and wasn't there. When he found out about what happened to all his children, he was just devastated. He couldn't come to work for weeks. He also became Buffalo Parks Commissioner under his brother Jimmy Griffin, the mayor, in later years. And his life at one point too just began to unravel. That fire took an emotional toll on so many people that it's just very, very difficult to describe. But then now, when something like this happens, what's the next step? Well, the lawyers get involved. You have 90 days if you want to file a lawsuit. Well, almost every parent, almost, with few exceptions, had filed lawsuits in connection with the loss or injuries sustained by their children. Now, how much is a child's death worth? How much? Well, each of the families who lost a child in the fire, the 15, they were all given $10,000, where the settlements involved in the children who were injured amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time they turned 21 and were able to take their settlement. And there's a few stories that I told about in my book, to how these lawsuits and settlements affected the lives of some of these children. There's one young man, his name is Jackson Frank. Jackson was badly burned in the fire. He's, by the way, in that photograph right next to Tom Griffin, the teacher. But he wasn't given, it was like 50-50 or 60-40 that he wasn't going to survive. His injuries were so bad. Yet he kept fighting and struggling, and he was making headway. And one day, one visitor brought him a guitar, figuring that I'll bring this to the boy, maybe he'll be distracted a little bit, he'll have some fun with this guitar. Well, Jackson Frank became a very accomplished musician with that guitar that this visitor had brought him. He became very, very good. And he survived, and he subsequently graduated from Cleveland Hill Elementary School from the 8th grade. And at that point, his mom and dad transferred him to the town of Elma, where he became a student in the Iroquois Central School District. And that's where Jackson Frank graduated from high school. Now, I lived in the town of Elma for many, many years. And one day I got the bright idea that I was going to get involved in politics and change the whole world, you know. And I met this woman. Her name was Marilyn Frank. She was a local government dog. She kept every politician honest. No one wanted to tangle with her. Okay. I had many conversations with Marilyn Frank. We talked about family. We talked about this. She never mentioned that her son was Jackson Frank, who was burned in the Cleveland Hill fire. The people involved in this fire never talked about it. It was never brought up in school. After Jackson Frank graduated from Iroquois, it was only a couple of years later that he received his settlement, which at that point amounted to just over something like $720,000. So tax-free money. Now, Jackson's mom and grandmother decided, you know, before this boy, you know, goes on to the next phase of his life, let's take him on a trip. They took him down south. They took him to Gettysburg, some of the Civil War sites, and they drifted over to Memphis, Tennessee, and they visited Graceland Mansion, which was the home of Elvis Presley. And when the caretaker who was showing the group around heard Jackson Frank's story from mom, he said, wait. And believe it or not, he went to the back of the house where Elvis was in his swimming pool, and he brought Elvis Presley out to meet Jackson Frank. That photograph of Elvis that was taken by his mom is in my book. Elvis is there in his swimming trunks. But now, Jackson Frank, of course, this was a highlight of his life, you know, meeting Elvis Presley. But the best was yet to come when Jackson got his settlement and decided that he thought his future in music would take off better if he were in Britain, in England. And of course, he was right. It was 1964. You know what was going on in 1964. The Beatles were just one of them. But the two people that Jackson Frank befriended in Britain were Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. Now, Simon and Garfunkel produced Jackson Frank's one and only album. It was a minor hit here and there. It wasn't a big mega hit. But still, because of what happened to Jackson Frank during that fire, his life just slowly unraveled. For every bit of progress, every little success he made, there was always, 2 steps backward. And his life began to unravel. And he died in the 1990s. He's now a member of the Buffalo Music Hall of Fame. But he died a very tragic death. Now, there was another person who was badly burned in that fire. It was a young lady. Her name was Patty Patricia Noel. Her photograph is among the ones you're looking at in that photograph I passed by. Patty Noel was one of these adventurous kids. And back then, she had told her parents that when she gets her settlement, she wants a brand new car and she's going to Hawaii. The allure of the Hawaiian Islands was just capturing everybody's imagination, especially back there in that time. And the impetuous youth in her, she just couldn't wait to go. So when she got that settlement, she got a brand new Buick. And then she said, Mom and Dad, and went to Hawaii for 2 weeks. And she came home a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. She was diving in water that she thought was 20 feet deep, and it was about 1.5 feet deep. And she struck her head and was paralyzed. But never complained once. When people approached her to ask if they thought she was being treated unfairly, she said, absolutely not. She says, life is too short. You accept what's happening and life goes on. Her mom and dad took care of her for more than 20 years. Oxygen tanks, wheelchairs, medically equipped vans with the best medical equipment. But still, her quality of life just began to deteriorate, and there was no quality of life. And her mom and dad, after a while, had to make a decision one way or the other. That was one of those pull the plug. But that's Patty Noel's story. Now, Jim Luongo. This young lady mentioned to me that she knew Jim Luongo because he became a teacher at Maryville. Now, when Jim Luongo was burned in the Cleveland Hill school fire, when reporters were talking to him about, how he felt, does he feel like he was lucky? Would he ever, how could you go through something? He goes, don't feel sorry for me. He says, you know something? This was nothing. This was nothing. What do you mean it was nothing? I mean, you almost died. That's when Jim Luongo told them his story. Jim Luongo had just survived polio in some of the worst stages. He had, to give him some proper stature, big shields out of fiberglass across his chest and his back. And all of the investigators of the fire figured that if he didn't, he would have burned to death if he wasn't protected. But he had spent most of his young life as a polio victim, including being in an iron lung. So he said, you know something? Compared to that, this fire was nothing. So don't feel sorry for me. He became a teacher. He teaches at Maryville successfully and had a snow plowing business in Cheektowaga. And he died a few years ago. His father, by the way, was a maintenance man in the janitorial department of Cleveland Hill Schools when the fire broke out. Now, there's another young lady I want to tell you about. Her name is Mary Bell Bressler. I know Mary Bell. Every once in a while, if she feels up to it, I bring her to one of my presentations so people can actually talk with her. When I heard Mary Bell's story, I said, "Oh my God, I got to go meet her." And she lives in the town of Cheektowaga, off of in the William Street, New York State Thruway area down in there. She said, "I came this close to being in the fire." So I had her explain. And she was so emotional, she was in tears for most of this interview. But she said, "I was in the music room before that class took over, and I left my violin there. And I had to get the early bus home from school, and so I wanted to get my violin so I can take it home to practice." And she said, as soon as I was about to go down the hallway into the music room, I was only 3 or 4 feet away from the door. Boom. That's when that big swoosh, that sucking sound happened. So, and it drove her back. It drove her back. But that could have been number 16 if she was actually in that room, because she would have never been able to get out. Now, Mary Bell, as we were conducting the interview, she was describing to me how she went to her teacher and said, "Mrs. Graham, I need a note from you so that I can be in the hallway. Otherwise, you couldn't be in the hallway without a permission slip." That's how disciplined these kids were back then. And she said, "Hold on a second. And you'll find this in my book too." She showed me a note. It's a note signed by Mrs. Graham, and it says, "Mary Bell has permission to go to the music room." She had saved that note for all of these 72, 73 years. And now, there are people who really take this seriously, and some would just take it very casually. I told you that there was a cap and gown salesman in the music room. Okay. His name is Robert K. Winters. Well, he was the first person called to testify county grand jury. And he said to the investigators, "I don't know how I got out of the room. I don't know how." All I can remember is everybody, we heard that sound. It sounded like an explosion. And everybody started going through the windows. And I did everything I could to help the children. But I don't know how I got out. But I found myself in the snow outside. And as they were passing some of the children through the windows, I tried to help them. Well, for some reason, I don't know why, but his testimony didn't pass the smell test with me. It was just a hunch. I had nothing to base what I was thinking on, nothing. So I started investigating. I found out he was based in Syracuse, New York. That's where the cap and gown company from Champaign, Illinois, had his office. And so I started to go through the newspapers of the time. Syracuse Post-Standard, I think it was, and there's another one, the Journal. There were two. I went into April 1st, 1954, and I got the front page of the Post-Standard. You'll find a picture of it, by the way, if you're looking in that book, way in the back. And it says, Syracusan, hero, saving children as fire sweeps a school near Buffalo, New York. I mean, and so I went and looked into another Syracuse newspaper, and there's another one. Hail to the hero who risked his life to save all these children, you know, breaking windows, help pushing children through, saving their life. I said, when this guy testified before the Erie County Grand Jury, he didn't say anything about this. The guy just embellished everything he could. Who knows why he did this, but it was a lie. Why he would embellish his role in the fire and calling himself a hero when he had nothing to do with helping any of those kids. He probably got out of that building so fast, that's all he cared about. But then again, too, there's a beautiful photograph of him in both Syracuse newspapers in his Army Air Force uniform. He was an outstanding member of the armed services. He had honorably discharged. He was an airline mechanic. I mean, he has so much to be proud of. Why would he do something like this? But there's no question, it was just an embellished. Anyway, if there's one good thing that happened, it was the fact that there has never been a school fire anywhere in New York State since the Cleveland Hill fire, because of all the fire code reforms that were put into practice. Sprinkler alarms, direct communications from schools to the fire police stations. And they were all put into effect very quickly, not only here in Buffalo, but throughout New York State and eventually throughout the entire United States. And newspapers across the country back then had reported that these reforms that are going to be saving children's lives, all came about because of the sacrifices made by all these children who died in the Cleveland Hill school fire. Now, all these settlements I was telling you guys about, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it came into millions, really. Who was going to pay for that? Taxpayers? Yep, that's exactly right. But no one complained. The bond issues that funded, the borrowed money to pay all these lawsuits, very few people voted no. So it all sort of had a happy ending. But that's the story of the Cleveland Hill fire. I told you about my suspicions as to, what the cause of the fire was. But the main cause of the Cleveland Hill fire was the fact that all of the complaints of teachers and students over months and years were just not addressed by the school administration. They were just ignored. If they were taken care of back then, that fire would have never started. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Taught school again well after that fire, because he was my sixth grade teacher and he was my brother's fifth grade teacher. We were not there.
The question here was about Tom Griffin, Jimmy Griffin's brother. You know, did he teach school? Yes, he did. He stayed at Cleveland Hill for a number of years after that. And not only was he a teacher, but he was also heavily involved in the school's basketball team. I think it was basketball, I'm not sure, but he was involved in sports and helping, conduct boys, watching them over, sports and. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes, ma'am.
That particular building actually built, and what grade was that? Was that fourth grade?
This is the sixth grade class. Sixth grade. There were two sixth grade classes back then. What was that? Oh, thank you for that. I asked you to look at number 21 in that picture. Okay. But yes, you're right. That you asked me two questions. One about, okay, the annex was built, this particular annex was built in 1941. It was built primarily like the Tyrunda Annex to accommodate children of Defense Department plants here in the Buffalo area. However, it became very necessary back in the early 1950s, at the end of World War II, when they just couldn't find room for all these kids. There were so many kids enrolled in school that the school district couldn't accommodate them. Now, that photograph, number 21, and I almost feel guilty because after I wrote this book and after I'm reviewing, all of the used, and I was saying, geez, why didn't I use this? Why didn't I do something with this? And then I looked at that picture and I go, who is this kid, number 21? Number 21 was Barbara Benson. Where she is today, I wish I knew. Because a short time before the Cleveland Hill fire, her parents bought a new house outside the district and she moved. Otherwise, she would have probably been in that music room too. Her name was Barbara Benson. I do not know what happened to her. I sort of regret that because it would have been a very interesting part of the story. Yes?
Was attached to, still in use as a Cleveland Hill school.
Oh, yes, it's in use today. It's in use today. It's right on Mapleview Drive, right on Mapleview Drive. As you go there, in fact, when you go down Mapleview Drive, you can see the memorials of the students who died and the students who were injured. And right in that general area, on the going inside the courtyard, is where the annex was. And the displays honoring these kids, recalling their lives so they wouldn't be forgotten, was always a matter of contention years ago. No one wanted to talk about the fire. Nobody. It's a funny thing. This fire, the fire in this building here, look at that. It's horrendous. It was taken by a fellow by the name of Nelson Frank. Now, Nelson Frank was no stranger to me because in later years, Nelson and I belonged to the same camera club, Buffalo Area Industrial Photographers. So we would have a meeting at Chef's Restaurant once a year. And one year, it was my responsibility to get a guest speaker. So I'm saying to myself, you know, I got a guest speaker a few years prior to that, and it was easy, but I couldn't think of anybody that would really interest all these guys and these gals in the club. And so this guy comes up to me and he goes, "Why don't you ask Nelson Frank to talk?" I go, "Nelson Frank, why? Why? I mean, what would he talk about?" He says, "Well, you remember the Cleveland Hill fire?" I go, "Yeah, I do." Well, Nelson Frank took all of those iconic photographs of the fire and he fed them to the Buffalo News, who then fed them to the Associated Press and United Press International and to Life magazine. Life magazine did a 4 or 5 page spread on the Cleveland Hill fire. Unfortunately, it didn't make the cover of the magazine. The new hydrogen bomb and what it and the amount of people it could kill if it was dropped. That made the cover of Life magazine that particular month, April 19th, 1954. Anyone have any further questions? Yes, ma'am.
Went to Wall Street School in Lancaster in 1954.
Mhm.
It's condemned in that year after the fire.
Oh, the annex in Lancaster.
The annex, it was the whole Wall Street School.
Oh, wow.
School got condemned and now
It probably was a wooden school, wasn't it?
it's brick.
Yeah.
It's like at one entrance.
Yeah, there had to be multiple entrances to school. There had to be windows that could be opened. Anything that resembled how the annex was built. All those annexes were quickly shut down and they were just gone as fast as you could say, we don't like wood. And there was an aversion, despite the fact that all your houses are built out of wood, there was an aversion to building anything to do with a school out of wood. And it went on for a long time. Yes, ma'am.
I did Maryville School back in the 50s. I was in kindergarten when the fire. And it was a brick building, it's still standing in the corner of Cuba and Maryville. And it only had one door going in and steps going straight up to the second floor. And that was the only entrance and exit. And after the fire, all the kids were taken out of that school. And I was in kindergarten, but I ended up finishing the year in the high school as a kindergarten.
That's right. A lot of buildings and schools did not meet the new fire codes, were temporarily closed until corrections were made to the buildings. There had to be windows, there had to be points of escape. Windows had to be opened and they had to be big enough. And there had to be more than one entrance, to each of those classrooms. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming. One lady asked me another question about my book and whether or not it's going to be, published again. But like I say, it's very, very costly, and I just don't know. I mean, I'm 84 years old, so I like to think I have a lot of time left, but there's a lot to publishing a book, and I've done a lot of research, and I think my story that's going to appear in Western New York Heritage Magazine later on this year. I'm looking forward to that and putting a lot of effort into that. A lot of the photographs you saw here and some photographs that haven't been published yet are going to appear in the magazine. So But there's a chance I may, there's a chance that there might be another printing, but right now it's sort of complicated and it's a little on the costly side. So,
Really appreciate it if you could.
huh?
We'd really appreciate it if it could be.
Well, thank you. It's very nice of you. And thank you all for coming today. Thank you. Oh, incidentally, one more thing that you may be interested in. Although I'm going to cut back because of my health, I am going to tell you about my next project. And I don't have a title for it yet, but if I did have a title for it, it would be What Will Become of All Our Cemeteries? We have cemeteries here in Western New York. We probably could fit every National Football League team in Cheektowaga on the property that cemeteries are accommodating in Cheektowaga. And you go to a cemetery today, you're virtually there on your own. People just don't visit cemeteries like they used to. And this is sacred ground. You can't just say, we got to do something about this. I mean, it's not that easy. But something will be done sooner or later with all these cemeteries because they're occupying prime real estate and no one is visiting. No one.
So much more popular. Nobody actually uses them as much.
Yeah.
No.
Well, again, thanks very much.